David and Lavera thought wife swapping would be just a daring adventure, while Mark and Susan believed it was only a harmless game. But what began as curiosity soon spiraled into a dark obsession that ended in blood, betrayal, and murder. In the heart of a quiet suburban neighborhood, life seemed to move in a predictable rhythm. Neighbors greeted each other on their morning walks, lawns were trimmed neatly, and the sound of children playing echoed down the cul-de-sacs. From the outside, everything looked perfectly normal. Behind closed doors, however, there was a secret that no one would have ever guessed. Two couples who lived only a few houses apart had entered into an arrangement that most people would never dare to imagine. They had agreed to exchange partners, not permanently, but as a way to escape the routines of marriage that had grown dull over the years. What started as a reckless thrill was never meant to change the course of their lives, but the decision would soon lead them into a dark path from which there would be no return. The idea began casually, as if it were nothing more than a daring game. Both couples were friends, often sharing meals, attending neighborhood gatherings, and spending evenings talking long into the night. Their bonds grew comfortable, and curiosity began to creep into places it shouldn't have. They convinced themselves it would be harmless, a secret kept only between the four of them, something they could control with clear boundaries. They saw it as a temporary adventure, something to breathe life into the ordinary. There was no talk of consequences, only the rush of doing something forbidden. In their minds, they were still in charge of the situation. At first, the arrangement carried the spark they had hoped for. It was dangerous, exciting, and hidden from the world around them. Each couple believed they could keep emotions separate from actions, that their marriages were strong enough to withstand what they were doing. In those first weeks, they returned to their daily lives, still smiling at their neighbors, still mowing their lawns, still showing up to work as if nothing had changed. The secret gave them a sense of power, a belief that they could live outside the rules and remain untouched. Yet, even in those early days, small cracks began to form. One husband found himself drawn too deeply into the experiment. What had been meant as a passing thrill began to stir something restless inside him. He started to look at his neighbor's wife differently, not as someone sharing in the game, but as someone he wanted for himself. At first, he tried to ignore the feelings, brushing them aside as nothing more than excitement fueled by the forbidden. But the more time he spent with her, the stronger the pull became. The idea of returning to his own marriage, as if nothing had happened, felt unbearable. His wife noticed subtle shifts in his behavior, distraction, late nights, and a distance that hadn't been there before. He brushed off her concerns, but his mind was already elsewhere. The woman he desired sensed the change, too. What was supposed to be temporary had become complicated. She had never intended for this to mean more than it did, and she began to grow uneasy with the way he looked at her, the way he lingered, the way his eyes followed her across a room. She tried to tell herself that it was just part of the game, that it would eventually fade, but unease settled in her chest. For her, the arrangement was still just an experiment, something she could walk away from. For him, it was already becoming an obsession. The neighborhood remained blissfully unaware. Barbecues were still held, children still played, and neighbors still waved. Nobody noticed the hidden tension building in the lives of the two couples. The silence of secrecy kept everything locked away, but secrets have a way of growing heavier over time. Each stolen moment, each shared glance, and each hidden meeting added weight to a situation that was never meant to be sustainable. For three of them, it was still a game. For one, it was becoming the center of his world. The more he thought about her, the less he cared about his own marriage. His wife's presence became an annoyance, a reminder of the life he no longer wanted. He stopped investing in his relationship, growing colder and distant. He told himself that what he felt was more than lust, that it was something real, something worth risking everything for. He convinced himself that she felt the same way, mistaking politeness for affection, mistaking silence for encouragement. His reality began to shift, and soon the game was no longer about fun, it was about possession. She, on the other hand, began pulling back. What once felt thrilling now carried a shadow of danger. She tried to create distance, limiting the time spent together and focusing on her marriage again. Her husband was unaware of just how deep the other man's feelings had become. He believed the arrangement was still under control, still something they could step away from when it stopped feeling exciting. He didn't see the way the other man's eyes lingered too long or how his casual excuses to visit seemed to grow more frequent. He didn't sense the danger building beneath the surface. The arrangement, which was supposed to be temporary, had already changed everything. Boundaries that had once seemed clear were now blurred, and emotions were tangled in ways they hadn't anticipated. Each day, the obsessed husband slipped further from reality, convincing himself that fate had brought him something he could not ignore. He thought of her constantly, imagining a future that was never his to claim. His wife began to feel the growing distance, but she didn't yet understand the depth of his fixation. To the outside world, they were still a normal suburban couple. Inside their home, however, a storm was brewing. The secret that had once bonded the two couples together was now beginning to tear them apart. None of them could see it yet, but the path they had chosen was leading them toward disaster. The decision that had seemed like a harmless escape was in fact the first step into something far darker. While the neighborhood carried on as usual, a dangerous obsession was quietly taking root, one that would soon grow beyond anyone's control. The weeks following their reckless agreement shifted the atmosphere in subtle yet powerful ways. What had begun as a daring thrill quickly lost its playful edge for most of the people involved. The excitement of secrecy no longer carried the same weight, and for three of them, the arrangement had started to feel like something better left behind. They wanted to move forward, to return to the ordinary lives they had risked for a taste of the forbiddens. But for one man, walking away was impossible. His heart and mind had become locked on the woman who was never meant to be his. What had been born out of curiosity transformed into something far more consuming. He could not see her as part of a temporary game anymore. He saw her as the answer to everything missing in his life. At first, his fixation showed in small ways. He found excuses to drive past her house, to linger longer during conversations, to invent reasons to call or stop by. These actions seemed harmless to outsiders, gestures that could be explained away as friendly or neighborly. But to him, each moment carried weight, each interaction felt charged with meaning. He memorized her routines without realizing how unnatural it had become. He noticed when her car left in the morning, when she returned from errands, and when her lights went out at night. The ordinary details of her life became the rhythm of his obsession. His wife began noticing his distraction. He was no longer present at the dinner table, his phone lighting up late into the evening as he stared without answering her questions. When she confronted him about his distance, he dismissed it with vague explanations, but his actions betrayed him. His eyes wandered toward the house down the street, and his words grew sharper, as though she were the one pulling him away. His marriage became little more than a shadow, but he no longer cared. The woman next door had taken the place of everything he once valued. The object of his fixation felt the change in ways that left her uneasy. She no longer saw a neighbor or a friend, but a man whose presence lingered too long and whose gaze burned with unspoken words. The agreement had lost its appeal, and she wanted no part of it anymore. She tried to create distance, focusing her energy back into her marriage and her own home. Yet the more she pulled away, the more determined he became. He read meaning into her silence, convincing himself that she wanted him but was too afraid to admit it. His reality began twisting into something dangerous, where rejection no longer registered as truth but as a challenge. Her husband noticed the tension but underestimated its depth. He believed that stepping away from the arrangement would solve everything, that they could return to normal life and leave the experiment behind. He didn't see the intensity growing in the other man's eyes, didn't recognize that the lines they had crossed could not be redrawn. For him, it was simply time to end the game. For the other man, it was the beginning of something he thought he could claim forever. The obsessed husband began isolating himself from everyone else. He pulled away from friends, skipped gatherings, and avoided time with his own family. He used these moments to focus more on her, on the idea of her that had consumed his thoughts. He started writing down his feelings in notebooks, letters he would never send but believed someday she would read. He dreamed of a life where the two of them were together openly, imagining scenarios that ignored the reality of her marriage, her family, and her lack of interest. In his mind, Those obstacles were temporary, and it was only a matter of time before she realized they belonged together. The more she resisted, the more unpredictable his behavior became. He began showing up uninvited, knocking on her door under flimsy pretenses, or leaving small tokens on her porch that she did not want. At first, they were harmless enough: flowers, a book, a handwritten note without a name. But the gifts grew stranger, more personal, as though he wanted to prove he understood her better than anyone else. Each gesture tightened the grip of fear around her. What had once been a private experiment between consenting adults had shifted into something that felt threatening, something she no longer had control over. She tried to avoid him, but avoidance only fueled his determination. He followed her from a distance, appearing in places she hadn't expected to see him. A quick trip to the grocery store became unsettling when she noticed him in the next aisle, pretending to shop. A walk through the park felt suffocating when she caught sight of him watching from a distance. These moments were not coincidences. They were carefully calculated by a man who had convinced himself that fate was guiding him. His own wife lived in a growing silence, aware that her husband was slipping further away but powerless to stop it. She saw the obsession taking root, but every attempt to address it was met with denial or anger. She had been part of the same arrangement, but, unlike him, she wanted it buried, forgotten, erased from their lives. She realized too late that he had been altered by it in ways she could not undo. Her marriage was already beyond saving, but worse, she began to fear what he might be capable of if the woman he wanted continued to reject him. The neighborhood itself remained unaware of the storm brewing beneath its surface. Children still played in yards, neighbors waved from driveways, and the routines of suburban life carried on unchanged. But behind closed doors, unease grew. The once playful arrangement had transformed into a secret that now carried danger. 3 of them wished they could undo what they had done, but for one, it was already too late. His fixation had crossed the line into obsession, and his world revolved around a woman who wanted nothing more than distance. The tension stretched tighter with every passing day, like a thread pulled to the point of breaking. He told himself that he was fighting for love, that his persistence would eventually win her over. But in reality, each step he took was pushing her further away, each gesture a reminder of the danger that now followed her. She could no longer look at him as a neighbor, a friend, or even as part of a failed experiment. She saw him as a shadow that refused to leave her life, a presence she could not escape. In his mind, however, she was the only thing that mattered. He ignored the collapse of his own marriage, the suspicion of his wife, the rejection of the woman he desired, and the growing discomfort of her husband. None of it mattered because he had convinced himself that destiny was on his side. What began as a choice made in secrecy was now spiraling out of control, and the dangerous fixation that had taken hold of him was only growing stronger. The neighborhood had always seemed like a picture of stability, but slowly the cracks began to show. It wasn't indeed just inside the homes of the 2 couples involved in the arrangement. It was seeping into the streets, into the way people looked at one another, into the quiet unease that lingered in the air. What had once been the comfort of familiarity was turning into suspicion and whispers. The couples who had thought they could keep their secret hidden were now unraveling, piece by piece, and one man's fixation was becoming impossible to disguise. The woman at the center of his obsession felt the pressure of it every single day. She noticed the way he always seemed to be nearby. His car pulling into the street when she returned from errands, his shadow on the sidewalk when she went for her morning walks. It was no longer coincidence. Every time she tried to reclaim her sense of normalcy, he appeared like a reminder that their past choices could not be erased. She began locking doors earlier, pulling curtains closed even in the middle of the day, and double-checking the windows before going to bed. The sense of freedom she had once enjoyed in her own home was slipping away. Her husband sensed her unease but could not fully grasp its weight. He thought that ending the arrangement would have been enough, that with time everything would settle and return to how it once was. He underestimated the intensity of the other man's feelings, mistaking them for harmless longing rather than something dangerous. His focus remained on repairing their marriage, on restoring trust, but she could not shake the fear that danger was creeping closer. She tried to explain her discomfort, but he reassured her with calm words. never realizing that the problem had already grown beyond what either of them could manage. The obsessed husband, meanwhile, was spiraling deeper into his fixation. He started keeping track of her movements with alarming precision, writing down the time she left her home and when she returned. He invented excuses to interact, leaving borrowed items at her doorstep or creating reasons to speak briefly. In his mind, these interactions were evidence of a connection, proof that she still cared in some unspoken way. He convinced himself that she was only pretending to push him away, that her attempts to avoid him were born of fear of discovery rather than rejection. His reality no longer aligned with the truth. His wife lived in silence, watching the distance between them grow like a canyon. She no longer recognized the man she had married. His eyes, once warm, now carried a feverish intensity whenever the other woman's name came up. Nights became battles of silence, the two of them moving through the same house as strangers. She tried to confront him, but every word she spoke seemed to drive him further into secrecy. She knew he was slipping away, but she also sensed something darker beneath his obsession. It was not just desire, it was control, an unwillingness to accept that he could not have what he wanted. Neighbors began noticing strange things. One woman remarked about seeing him parked on the corner late at night, sitting in his car with the engine off. Another noticed him walking alone in the rain, circling the same block over and over. Small details that might have been brushed off individually began to form a pattern. Yet nobody spoke openly about it because nobody wanted to believe something dangerous could be brewing in a neighborhood so ordinary. The lawns were still trimmed, the mailboxes still painted, and the children still rode their bikes freely. The surface looked normal, but the foundation was beginning to crack. The woman he wanted so desperately began to feel trapped in her own home. She couldn't shake the sense of being watched. A movement outside the window, the sound of footsteps on the sidewalk, or the flicker of headlights at night made her heart race. She confided only sparingly to her husband, worried that pressing the issue too hard might make things worse. She wanted to believe the problem would fade with time, but deep down, she knew it was growing. Each attempt to distance herself seemed to fuel his determination. Every cold shoulder became a challenge for him to overcome. His obsession was no longer just emotional. He began collecting items that reminded him of her, things she had touched or given away. Things that held no meaning to anyone else but to him became tokens of their supposed connection. He stored them in secret places, building a shrine in his mind to the woman who was slipping further from reach. The intensity of his fixation left no room for logic. He no longer saw her as an individual with her own life and choices. He saw her as a prize that had been promised and then unfairly taken away. His wife stumbled upon evidence of his obsession one evening when she found a notebook filled with writings about the other woman. Pages upon pages described her habits, her smile, her daily movements. It was a disturbing glimpse into a mind unraveling, and it terrified her. She realized that what she had dismissed as infatuation had grown into something far more sinister. But fear kept her silent. She didn't confront him, worried that it would trigger anger, worried that it would expose how much she had seen. Instead, she lived with the knowledge that her husband was no longer hers in any meaningful way, that his thoughts and desires belonged entirely to someone else. The couple at the center of the obsession tried to rebuild their lives quietly, but tension crept into every corner of their marriage. She was distant and cautious, while he struggled to understand why she couldn't let go of her fear. Their once happy home was filled with unspoken words and restless nights. Every knock on the door or unexpected phone call made her flinch, and her husband grew frustrated, not realizing the danger was very real. He thought time could heal what had been broken, but time was only feeding the obsession of the man down the street. The more the obsessed husband felt rejected, the more unstable he became. He alternated between desperation and rage, between longing and resentment. In his mind, she owed him something, a love he believed had already been promised. He could not accept her silence as final. He saw her fear not as a warning, but as evidence that she still cared, that she was only resisting because of her marriage. He believed he was the answer to her unhappiness, blind to the truth that he was the cause of it. The neighborhood remained unaware of how close things were to breaking. They saw glimpses of tension, but never the whole picture. Behind the doors of those suburban homes, a dangerous story was unfolding, fueled by secrecy, obsession, and denial. The woman who had once been part of a reckless game was now living in a prison of fear, while the man who claimed to love her was slowly turning into her greatest threat. The cracks in the perfect facade were no longer invisible. They were spreading like fractures in glass, leading toward a shattering that no one could stop. Do you want me to keep the same psychological suspense style for Chapter 4, or shift toward a grittier, forensic-style narrative as the story moves closer to the breaking point? The spiral toward destruction had been slow, but once it reached its tipping point, the decline felt rapid and unstoppable. The obsessed husband had crossed a threshold where his thoughts no longer followed reason. He stopped caring about appearances, about the mask of normalcy he had once worn so easily. His coworkers noticed his absence, his lack of focus, his unpredictable temper. Friends who had once enjoyed his company began to avoid him, uncomfortable with the intensity in his eyes and the way he brought every conversation back to the same subject. His world had grown small, revolving around one person who wanted nothing to do with him. Everything else, work, friends, even his marriage, fell to the side like meaningless distractions. His wife lived in a constant state of dread. The home they had built together no longer felt like hers. She tiptoed around his moods, careful with her words, afraid to provoke his anger. The discovery of the notebooks haunted her. She could not unsee the pages filled with disturbing devotion to another woman. She considered leaving him but felt trapped by fear and uncertainty. The thought of what he might do if she walked out made her freeze in place. The man she had once trusted had become someone unrecognizable, someone she no longer felt safe beside. The woman who had unwillingly become the object of his obsession grew more desperate. She tried to create firm boundaries, to cut off every avenue of communication. She blocked his number, avoided public encounters, and limited her time outside the home. She confided more deeply in her husband, explaining the extent of the stalking and the way it made her feel like a prisoner in her own neighborhood. He tried to reassure her, but his reassurances rang hollow. He had underestimated the obsession too many times, and now he struggled to catch up with the gravity of the situation. He considered confronting the man directly, but worried it would provoke him further. The tension between them simmered like a storm that refused to break. For the obsessed husband, rejection became unbearable. Every boundary she set, every attempt to cut him off, only deepened his anger. He began to feel wronged, convinced that he was being denied something that should rightfully be his. His thoughts twisted into resentment, painting himself as a victim, a man betrayed by the people closest to him. He told himself that she was lying to herself, that her rejection was a mask, that deep down she wanted him but was trapped by obligation. His delusion became his reality, and reality itself slipped further from his grasp. The nights were the worst. He would sit in his car with the engine off, parked on dark corners of the neighborhood, staring at her house. Sometimes he stayed for hours, watching the lights flicker on and off, imagining her life inside without him. Other times he walked the streets in silence, his footsteps echoing in the still air as he circled her block again and again. He felt both powerless and powerful, powerless in her rejection, yet powerful in his ability to monitor her, to remind himself that she could never fully escape him. The secrecy of his surveillance fed his fantasies, reinforcing his belief that they were connected in ways no one else understood. The woman sensed his presence even when she couldn't see him. A shadow at the edge of the yard, a parked car at the end of the street, a sudden rustle outside the window, all of it fed her fear. She stopped sleeping through the night, waking at the slightest sound, heart pounding in her chest. Her husband grew frustrated at first, insisting they could not live in fear forever. But even he could not ignore the mounting evidence. The phone calls with silence on the other end, the strange items left on their doorstep, the unsettling feeling of being watched wherever they went. He began to realize they were trapped in something larger than they could control. The obsession escalated into threats hidden within words and gestures. A note appeared in her mailbox, vague but chilling, promising that things were not over between them. A small gift was left on her car, an object that held no value to anyone else, but carried a clear message to her: he was always near. These acts pushed her closer to panic, and her husband finally acknowledged that they were in real danger. He wanted to involve the police but hesitated, afraid of exposing their secret arrangement and the scandal it would bring to their lives. The shame of how it had all started kept them silent when they should have been seeking help. That silence gave the obsessed husband even more freedom to continue unchecked. Inside his own mind, the pressure was unbearable. He was consumed by a mixture of longing and rage, a storm that shifted violently from one to the other. He imagined scenarios where they were together openly, living the life he believed was theirs by destiny. But he also imagined darker outcomes, ones where, if he could not have her, no one else would. These thoughts began to feel less like fantasy and more like inevitability. His notebooks filled with plans, with words that revealed the depth of his unraveling mind. His wife watched helplessly as he descended further. She wanted to reach out for help, but fear silenced her. She knew her husband had grown dangerous, not just to himself, but to others. She saw the fury in his eyes when he spoke of rejection, the coldness in his voice when he mentioned the other couple. The man she had once loved was gone, replaced by someone she barely recognized. Every night she wondered how long she could keep living under the same roof, how long before his obsession spilled into irreversible action. The breaking point came one evening after the woman he pursued confronted him directly. She told him with absolute finality that there was no future, no possibility, no hidden meaning behind her rejection. For her, it was a desperate attempt to close the door once and for all, to end the nightmare of being followed and harassed. But for him, it was the spark that ignited the fire he had been holding back. He felt humiliated, betrayed, and stripped of the fantasy he had clung to for so long. His rejection was not just a denial, it was an attack on the reality he had built for himself. That night he sat in silence, his mind boiling with rage and sorrow. He replayed her words again and again, each time twisting them into deeper wounds. He told himself that if she would not come willingly, then he had the right to decide how their story ended. His obsession had transformed into something darker, a conviction that control was the only way to resolve his pain. The man who had once lived as a friendly neighbor, a husband, a member of a seemingly ordinary community, had reached the point of no return. The quiet suburban neighborhood, unaware of the storm brewing in the shadows, carried on as though nothing had changed. Lights flickered in living rooms, children played in backyards, and families prepared for another ordinary day. But beneath the surface, something was about to snap. The tension that had stretched so tightly for months was ready to break, and when it did, it would shatter lives forever. The obsession that had once been hidden in secrecy was about to explode into violence, leaving behind a trail of devastation no one could have imagined. The night of the tragedy unfolded quietly at first, with nothing to suggest the violence that was about to erupt. The neighborhood was still, the kind of silence that only comes late in the evening when most families are behind closed doors. Lights glowed softly from a few windows, but the streets were empty. Inside one home, the woman who had endured months of unwanted attention tried to relax with her husband, both of them clinging to a fragile sense of peace. Yet even as they sat together, unease lingered in her chest. She could not shake the feeling that the man who haunted her thoughts was still watching, still waiting. Her instincts were right. Down the street, the obsessed husband sat alone in his car, parked just far enough away to avoid suspicion, but close enough to see the faint outline of her house. His heart pounded in his chest, his hands gripped the steering wheel until his knuckles turned white. The rejection he had received earlier replayed in his mind like a cruel echo. He had convinced himself for so long that they were destined to be together, that her resistance was only temporary. But now she had spoken words he could not twist, words that shattered the fantasy he had built around her. He felt humiliated, cornered, and filled with rage. In his fractured state, he told himself there was only one way to regain control. Hours passed as he sat in the dark, convincing himself of what needed to be done. He thought of her husband, of the life they shared, and jealousy burned through him like fire. He thought of his own wife, who no longer mattered to him, a woman he saw only as an obstacle to what he believed was his true purpose. His thoughts spiraled until reason no longer existed. By the time he stepped out of the car, he had already made his decision. The night air was cool against his skin, but his body trembled with adrenaline. The woman heard the first sound before anything else, a faint creak on the porch, the subtle shift of weight on the wooden boards. At first she froze, thinking it was her imagination, but then came another sound, unmistakable this time. Her heart raced as she grabbed her husband's arm, urging him to listen. He moved toward the window, pulling the curtain back just enough to glimpse the shadow outside. The sight filled him with dread. He recognized the figure instantly. It was the man they had both feared, standing at their door in the dead of night. Before they could react further, the door rattled. The obsessed husband forced his way inside, driven not by logic but by raw emotion. What followed was chaos. The confrontation was loud and violent, breaking the silence of the quiet street. He shouted words that made no sense, words fueled by delusion and anger. The husband tried to defend his home, to protect his wife, but the intruder was consumed by rage. The struggle was brief but brutal, ending with the husband collapsing under the weight of the attack. The woman screamed, her voice carrying through the neighborhood, but it was too late. The obsessed man turned his fury toward her. In his mind, he believed he was ending her suffering, ending the lies, ending the rejection that had cut him so deeply. The reality was much simpler and far more horrifying. He was committing a crime that could never be undone. When the violence ended, the house that had once been a place of safety was transformed into a crime scene. Blood stained the floor, shattered objects lay scattered across the room, and the air was filled with a silence more terrifying than any scream. Neighbors began to stir, some awakened by the noise, others drawn by the sound of the woman's cry. Lights flickered on across the street, and curious faces peered through blinds. A few stepped outside, their eyes catching the figure rushing away into the darkness. Sirens soon followed, flashing lights painting the quiet neighborhood in red and blue. Police cars surrounded the street, officers rushing into the home that now held a scene of devastation. The once ordinary suburb had been shattered in a single night. Inside, investigators found the woman lifeless, her husband badly injured and clinging to life. The evidence told a story of obsession turned deadly, a story of boundaries crossed and warnings ignored. It didn't take long for them to identify the suspect. The trail of obsession had been too obvious, the signs too numerous. His car was found abandoned only a few miles away, his belongings scattered inside. The notebooks that his wife had discovered became crucial evidence, filled with disturbing declarations and plans that revealed his unraveling state of mind. The arrest came swiftly. He was found hiding in a nearby town, his appearance disheveled, his words incoherent. He offered no resistance as officers took him into custody, as though the act of violence had drained him of everything. He spoke of destiny, of love, of betrayal, words that painted a picture of a man who had lost touch with reality. His wife, left behind in shock, became both a witness and a victim herself, her life forever altered by the choices he had made. The community struggled to comprehend what had happened. Neighbors who had once waved at one another in passing now gathered in hushed groups, their conversations filled with disbelief. They wondered how such darkness could exist so close to home, how a man they had once known as a friendly neighbor could commit such horrific acts. The truth was buried in the secrecy of the arrangement that had started it all, a decision born out of recklessness and curiosity that spiraled into tragedy. For the families involved, there was no escape from the consequences. One home was left empty, filled with memories of lives cut short. Another home became a place of shame and sorrow, its occupants shunned by neighbors who could not separate them from the crime. The trial that followed revealed the depth of the obsession, the evidence of stalking, the threats, and the violence that had been building for months. Every detail was laid bare, exposing the chain of decisions that had led to the night of murder. The obsessed husband was convicted, his life now confined within prison walls. But even there, his words carried the same twisted conviction. He never admitted guilt, never saw himself as a murderer. In his mind, he had acted out of love, a love he believed had been denied to him. His lack of remorse only deepened the horror for those who had lost everything because of him. The story spread beyond the neighborhood, making headlines as a cautionary tale. People across the country read about the wife swap that had turned deadly, about how a reckless arrangement had ignited an obsession that ended in murder. The tale became a reminder of how easily boundaries can blur, how secrets can fester, and how obsession can destroy lives. In the end, the quiet suburban street never felt the same again. The houses still stood, the lawns still grew, and the children eventually returned to play. But the memory of that night lingered, a scar that could not be erased. For those who lived through it, the tragedy was not just a story in the news. It was a reminder that beneath the surface of normal life, darkness can grow unnoticed until it finally explodes, leaving devastation in its wake.